Welcome to the Everything History Podcast. Today we have on Professor Morrissey from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He is a lecturer in early American and environmental history, and if you like what you hear, make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Okay, I'm here with Professor Morrissey. Sir, do you have a story for us?
Sure. Well, let me start, since we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. I'll start with a story about the Revolution.
Right.
Famous, as I suppose you detailed in your accounts of the American Revolution, a famous turning point is 1776, right? When it looks like the Continental Army is in really bad shape and perhaps desperate, right? They've had to abandon New York, and they wind up over across the other side of the Delaware River in New Jersey, and it's getting late into the winter, and et cetera. And Washington hatches this plan, right, to go and attack the Hessians at Trenton.
The Battle of Trenton.
Battle of Trenton, a very important turning point. And evidently, a loyalist spy figures out that this plan is underway, and he runs across, this is in late December. In fact, the battle takes place on Christmas. Mm-hmm. But the spy goes across in advance of Washington's movement across the Delaware, and everybody's familiar with this famous painting of Washington crossing the Delaware.
The icy Delaware.
The icy Delaware. And the spy goes and wants to alert the commander of the Hessian troops, about 800 soldiers there in Trenton, that this attack is coming, right? And the commander of that unit, I forget his name off the top of my head right now, but he's playing cards. He's engaged in a poker game. So he's
busy, basically.
His aide de camp says, we're not going to hear what the spy has to say. And of course, Washington is coming right now in this moment. And so the guy, the aide de camp takes a note from this spy, puts it into his coat pocket, and the poker game continues. Well, an hour later, Washington is there, and he routs the Hessians, captures 800 men. It's a major victory. Howe has to come and follow it up at Princeton, and in fact, the Continental Army beats Howe at Princeton. It's a major victory heading into the winter of 1776 and 1777. Well, that aide-de-camp has this note in his pocket, right, the whole time, that he knew that they were coming, and et cetera. So one of these kind of serendipitous.
Yeah, and I love that story too, because I told that one. Of course, you have to tell that one, because 1776 had previously been going so bad for Washington.
That's right.
And what's so amazing about that battle is it's like a hall of fame of American founding fathers that were there. You got George Washington, obviously, but Alexander Hamilton's leading a artillery regiment, if I remember right. And Aaron Burr is there. Roger Sherman is there. He was on the Constitutional Convention, and he was one of those 5 committee members that oversaw the Declaration writing. Yeah. I think, let's see, we got James Madison, James Monroe. It's just a whole slew of American Hall of Fame leaders.
The heavyweights. Yeah.
The heavyweight fighters of the Revolution. Yeah, and going off of that, what got you into your sect of history, particularly early American and environmental history?
Yeah, so I'm an early American historian. I'm interested in, as you say, environmental history. I'm interested in Native American history and sort of colonial history broadly. I guess, so in particular, I'm interested in sort of the frontiers and the borderlands of early America. And, my interest in those subjects comes from a lot of different places. I actually started, when I went to graduate school, having finished college, I wrote my senior thesis in college on 20th century politics. Actually, I wrote about third party politics in Minnesota. I'd gone to college in Minnesota, and I was really interested in, when I was in college, Jesse Ventura became the governor of Minnesota, running as a third party candidate. And there's actually a long, really interesting history of third-party politics in that state. And I focused on the Socialist Party, which controlled the state government for a good long time around World War I. And I figured I was going to do 20th century history when I got to graduate school, but then, well, I shouldn't say it like that. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but
you suspected.
I was I was moving in that direction, and then a couple of things. First of all, I'm really interested in history as a sort of as detective work. I mean, I love the sort of detective work of history, and something that's really appealing to me about early modern history is that it's really difficult. There aren't that many sources. I mean, 20th century history, you sometimes get overwhelmed with how much there is, how many documents there are, how much there is to kind of explore, and how many avenues to go down interpretively. I took my first seminar in graduate school, which was which was life-changing for me with a historian called John Demos. The first assignment that he gave us was, he gave us a little, I guess you could call it sort of a diary, commonplace book kind of document of something, a bit of a piece of writing that an individual in colonial Massachusetts in the 17th century did that was really cryptic. It was sort of like a daily record of weather and of what you might call a kind of astrology and kind of religious sentiment, and then kind of little affairs that happened to this person on the farm, and it was like about a year long, and we were and it was almost like a kind of fortune telling thing, embedded in this document. Anyway, he asked us without any context to try to figure out what we could make of it, and that really appealed to me. I mean, it really appealed to me that in fact, I mean, even if we had wanted to do a lot of research about it, it would be very difficult to find anything more about this individual who wrote the document. I mean, because who knows if that person even made any other documents that survived. So like the scarcity of the information, the scarcity of the document, the documentary record really appealed to me. It meant that you had to be really creative to sort of find out about the past, and then to kind of, interpret it and to tell stories about it. And, so that was part of the reason why I became interested in doing early American history. And then I think, this is not a thought original to me, but one thing that's fascinating and compelling about the early modern period is that so many themes that we live with today took their root in the that long span of time that we call the early modern era. And I'm thinking of things like, it was this really interesting moment of like early globalization when all these different peoples were coming together and encountering one another and intermingling and interacting and exchanging. And so there was that, and then, arguably capitalism sort of takes its roots in the early modern period. Things like slavery.
A lot of philosophy coming out, Enlightenment ideas.
Sure, 18th century kind of, the Enlightenment and the kind of birth of that whole epistemology that we kind of live with in many ways today. And then, even things like, when I say the beginnings of slavery, also things like the beginnings of race, the whole concept of race,
and racism
take their shape. So I was really, not only was I attracted to the intellectual challenge of doing early American history, but it didn't take too long for me to, as I was really getting going, to understand how important certain changes that took place in that early,
like certain historical trends, to see how important they really were. And going further into that, like, how do you go about doing the research on some of those scarce topics, like about the early Native American cultures and their like interactions with colonists? Like, where do you look for that information? Yeah,
well, it's a great question, and I'm right now working on a big project about the Illinois Indians, and I think I'm, every single day I'm trying to kind of creatively come up with ways to find information and use maybe unexplored sources of information about the past. So, I mean, the obvious answer, the biggest sources of information, especially for early Native American history, the biggest sources are, of course, archaeology, and then the written documents that were created by Europeans with whom Native Americans interacted. So a big source for me, I mean, among many others, but one that I'm very interested in, is the writings that were made by these missionary priests who came to I work on the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley. So the priests, the missionaries that came here were the Jesuits, and they were incredible recorders of information.
Yeah.
Every single year they'd write these relations, what they call the relations, to send back to Europe, which were, big accounts of
what time period are you looking at during that time?
So the classic Jesuit relations begin in the 1630s, and they run through the 1670s, but the Jesuits continued printing and writing and sending back to France what they called relations, even though they're not officially the Jesuit relations, well into the 18th century. So and these are just long accounts and descriptions of what they were doing among the native people, what the native peoples.
Is it a lot of like daily kind of just daily writing about like what's going on, like how they're interacting, or is it more specific things, or do they leave certain things out?
So great questions, because the documents are sometimes sort of daily accounts of events and things that are taking place. Oftentimes they're almost like ethnographic descriptions, because the Jesuits were, of course, trying to convert native peoples to Christianity. And part of their kind of philosophy, or their strategy of doing this missionary work, was that they wanted to first understand, obviously what native people thought of the world, what their cosmology was, in order to kind of effectively convince them that they should accept Christianity. And so they were really sensitive observers of native cultures. In fact, arguably, they were probably the most sensitive, in many ways, observers of native peoples among all the Europeans that I've studied in the early America. So, it's documents like those. Of course, as you say, you mentioned in your question, like, did they leave stuff out? Of course they left stuff out, and of course they got a lot wrong. They were very imperfect. These sources are very imperfect, but that's where the challenge comes in.
Yeah, definitely.
As a historian, it's like, okay, obviously these things are flawed, but in many ways they're the best things that we have to reconstruct these people's lives, and we can read them against the grain. Like the Jesuits wrote them with a specific intent and a specific purpose,
specific bias, perhaps.
Specific bias, but we can kind of, hopefully, if we read critically enough, we can correct for that, or we can read against it and read in a try to sort of cancel that bias out and look at these descriptions from a different perspective, and really kind of try to recapture some of the history of these people. So.
I think that's a very good example of that detective kind of work you're talking about, because some of it's perhaps conjecture, especially by those people, and they probably didn't see themselves as historians, What would you say they saw themselves as when they were writing those kinds of documents? Not just the Jesuits, but other interacting peoples with those natives. Yeah,
it's a good question. I mean, and I wouldn't generalize too much. I mean, some of our other great sources of information for writing history of native peoples in early America, are travelers, right? People who, they were going to the New World in the 17th and 18th century, for instance, kind of to explore and to sort of learn about it. They were going with a sense of the exoticness of what they were encountering, what they would
expected it to be exotic.
Exactly, right? And so, in some ways, those documents tell us more about
the exotic nature?
Well, and what the expectations were, right? They tell us, in some ways, they tell us more about the Europeans than they tell us about the native people. They tell us what the Europeans expected to see.
Like their writings is almost reflections of themselves and their own peoples?
Yeah, kind of like a strange mirror in which, the European is more reflected than the native people that is the object of the description. Nevertheless, again, though these documents are really flawed, if we try our best to kind of strip away those biases and those prejudices and those preconceptions, there is something there that we can use to kind of reconstruct the history of those people that are being described. So, it's hard to generalize about these sources. It's really
Definitely,
case by case,
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and that's why, again, I find this really fascinating and attractive, kind of as an intellectual project to go back and.
Here, I'll transition back to the American Revolution a little bit. Speaking of like bias and sources and whatnot, do you think generally the Western world, particularly the Americans I'm referring to, do you think they have a certain bias when it comes to like these sources of the American Revolution?
Do you mean the sources, the documentary sources, or do you mean the sources like as in the origins of the American Revolution, like where it came from? Like
a bit of the origins, and just like they only hear one lens, like they don't often hear like what's going on in the British Parliament. Like what I tried to bring up is arguments from like people like Edmund Burke that were strongly against the actions of the revolution or the British, and you don't really hear a lot about that exactly, but you hear a lot about patriot causes, and we always call them patriots when in the reality, I mean, I would almost refer to them as in the late 1760s as terrorists, like domestic terrorists, basically. Burning ships, obviously destroying tea, things like that. When you put it through the American lens, it's a little bit different, and I think a lot of people almost despise some American historians for doing that. Yeah,
well, it's a great thing for you to do, because I agree with the premise of your question. I think that very frequently when we think about the American Revolution, or the way that let's just put it this way, the way that it's sort of represented in American popular culture is, as a very virtuous, heroic movement. That was triumphing over oppression, right? Yeah. And I think it's actually really pretty easy to look at what was happening and tell a very different story, where the American Revolution came from, and I think that's the real intellectual challenge for many. For instance, when I teach the class here, I'm not trying to turn students into loyalists, but I am trying to push them towards a more complicated understanding of what was happening.
To more views that they perhaps haven't understood or haven't even heard before. Something like that.
Yeah. Well, for instance, I mean, I think the first thing is that we assume that the American Revolution kind of was an inevitability.
Yeah, definitely.
Right?
Predestination.
It was predestined. And the colonists were just kind of, they got here in the 17th century. They were, again, just very, very much exaggerating the
generalizations.
The popular conception of what American colonial history was all about. But they were escaping religious persecution back in England, and fleeing to a place like Massachusetts. And then, they set up these plantations, and they just sort of sat around twiddling their thumbs for, 10 generations, and then 1776 came, and finally they could declare independence, which is what they always wanted to do. But of course that's not true. Yeah. And I mean, it's really easy to complicate that narrative just by looking at some basic facts. So for instance, the American colonists were super prosperous, right? Mm-hmm. Under the British Empire, the supposedly oppressive British Empire. Fact number one. I mean, they were, in fact, among the most prosperous people in all the Atlantic world. Fact number two, I mean, we often think of the administration of the British Empire as being so overbearing, right? And the colonists just sort of like wanting so badly to get out from under this heavy-handed British administration.
Under the yoke of the British administration,
Right? I mean, that's false, right? The Navigation Acts, which were the regulations by which the British government controlled the 13 colonies, in many ways were advantageous to the people of the British colonies, right? I mean, they were not, they were part of a mercantilist economic system that was really, of course, designed to benefit the British Empire, probably first and foremost. But the colonists benefited greatly from that system themselves. They had guarantees of a market for all the raw materials that they were producing. So they were super prosperous. Many of them owned land, which was not something that British people, back in the mother country could expect to do. And, all to say, that's another reason why this idea or this kind of myth that we have in our heads that the British colonists were sort of struggling underneath the yoke of the oppressive British Empire is completely false. And then the third thing is that we have to keep in mind, and again, when I teach the American Revolution, I really try to make sure that the students do this as they're studying throughout the semester. we have to keep in mind that there were a lot of people opposed to the British, to the independence movement. You know, I mean, I think what we often say is it was about 2/5 strong patriots, 2/5 strong loyalists, and 1/5 in the middle, right? And so, you know, again, the myth is that, or the assumption is, what reasonable person could ever have disagreed with the movement towards independence? You know, who could have disagreed with the logic that Thomas Jefferson put down in the Declaration of Independence? Well, a lot of people disagreed with that logic. You know, a lot of people felt that they were just fine underneath the British government. And then I'll let you jump in here, but at any time. But the other piece to keep in mind when we study, especially the origins of the American Revolution and where it came from, is that all of those supposedly oppressive taxes in the 1760s and the 1770s leading up to the Declaration of Independence, you know, many of them were pretty reasonable things for the British government to have asked for.
Definitely, and they did it before to other parts of their empire.
And they were doing it to people, you know, in the UK, in England itself, right?
The British Isles themselves,
there were plenty high taxes in England. There were plenty of people in England who technically didn't get represented in Parliament.
Oh,
right?
yeah, definitely.
You know, the colonists, of course.
Yeah, Parliament was just on the rise. People have this like interpretation that it was the king and Parliament just pointing all their bad sticks at America or something like that. Yeah. In reality, you know, Parliament had just previously, in probably the last 70 years in the British Empire, they had just gained ascendancy, and everyone looks at the Parliament as, this oppressive entity of like aristocrats going against America. And in some parts, that's absolutely true. There are definitely sects of the Parliament. Then there is a reason, after all, that a large group of, you know, revolutionaries in America wanted independence, but also there were a lot of moderates, a lot of independents, and a lot of you know, conservative people in the British Empire that knew what they were doing was perhaps a little bit too much for that time period. Yeah. And what do you think about, going a little bit off that whole right for the time period thing, how much do you think the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War really influenced the happening of the American Revolution?
Yeah, great question. And of course, a super important context for understanding the controversies in the 1760s and the 1770s, because, you know, I mean, these estimates are rough estimates, but in the wake of the 7 Years' War, which was a global scale war,
a world war.
Oh yeah. A world war where the primary front, you know, the most important impetus for the beginnings of that war, and in fact, I think it's true to say that the most important sort of military kind of front of that war was North America. That was, to my understanding, the largest expeditionary force that the British had ever sent overseas up to that point.
Oh, it was massive. I forget the number, but yeah.
Massive expenditures on that expedition. Primary beneficiaries, of course, being
the colonists themselves,
the North American colonists. Many founding fathers themselves were speculators in those Western lands, which were now officially British territory.
George Washington being one of them.
George Washington, Ben Franklin, many of the founding fathers had joined land companies, speculation land companies in the West. And when, you know, at the end of that 7 Years' War in 1763, when a lot of things kind of intersected, Pontiac's rebellion in the West, and this huge debt that the British government had amassed,
accumulated,
so that in 1763 the British government said, drew a line on the map, this proclamation line in 1763. Declaring that the colonists would not have any access to the land west of the Appalachian Mountains.
Why do you think the empire bothered to do that exactly? Was it to prevent further conflict in those regions, or do you think it was something a little bit more economic?
I think both, and because the context here is in 1763, this Ottawa leader called Pontiac put together a pan-Indian kind of confederacy coalition to resist, to cooperate and resist British settlement, white settlement in the Ohio Valley, and practically, just in the West more broadly. It was very successful. They captured just about every British post in the West, save for, Michilimackinac and Detroit, I think. And all to say, in that context, the British were reasonably tired of war. They didn't want to be spending much more.
Yeah, they could have actually. Yeah, speaking of the 7 Years' War, they were definitely, the Empire was tired, particularly even Parliament, because they could have really smashed the French, especially in the European front, but they chose not to do it. And William Pitt, of course, was, a little bit booted out of office towards the end of his tenure because, he was a little bit too popular probably for King George III, especially after, they changed leadership with the monarchy during the war. But the British really could have gained a lot more from that war. Gained is a suspected word because, when you get too big, sometimes it's not actually a gain to an empire. But yeah, the empire definitely could have even reached even further at the end.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great point. And but the bottom line, back to your kind of question about economics and
with the proclamation line,
yeah, I think the number, these things are tough to estimate, but I think the number is something like 120 million sterling British pounds was the debt of the British Empire at the end of the 7 Years' War, which just to pay the interest on that loan, I think required something like 40% or 50% of the annual budget, the annual revenues of the realm. So it was an oppressive debt that the British Empire found itself in at the end of the 7 Years' War. So again, an interesting context in which to consider what became these hated taxes that the British were placing on the 13 colonies, right? Many of which were not particularly, in relative terms, they weren't particularly consequential. So, the Stamp Act, the first one, let's talk about the first one in particular, 1763, 1764, the Sugar Act, actually lowered the duties on taxes that the colonists had to pay. Or on sugar that the colonists had to pay. Subsequent tax programs, the Stamp Act, the Townshend duties, leading up in the 1770s to some of the more intolerable acts and et cetera. But when you look at those things kind of in the clear light of day, it wasn't like the British government was saying, okay, we're gonna get 120 million pounds out of the colonists themselves. That wasn't really the logic of it. Yeah. The logic of it was, well, the colonists need defense. The colonies need defense on their frontiers, right? This is in the context of imperial contestation that continues. Spain and France, they need, there is some military expense that is required.
In North America itself,
in North America itself, on the frontiers. Of course, Native Americans in the Ohio and the Mississippi valleys, rightfully sort of suspicious of the British intentions. So the British need to put in place some protective measures against that threat. That was pretty much what the British government wanted the colonists to pay for, was their own defense. And so, the logic of the Stamp Act, the logic of the Townshend duties, it's pretty reasonable. It's pretty reasonable in that context.
So taking that from the American context, why do you think a lot of these merchant Americans went so far against these taxes? Why did they call them intolerable acts? Why did they go so hard against these taxations?
Right. Well, that is where I think the really fascinating story of the American Revolution lies, is because that's a question of ideology.
Yeah.
Right. That's not a question of, you can't simply explain.
Yeah, it's not simple at all. No,
it's not simple. And this goes back to your original very smart observation that a lot of times we look at the American Revolution and the sources of the American Revolution and we think, oh, that's a simple thing. That's a simple problem.
Yeah.
Of course, inevitable that they would do. But it's really, that's where the intellectual, your question is right on the money. Why did they react so strongly to what, looking back on it, looks like a pretty reasonable slate of taxes? Why were they so angry? Mm-hmm. And the answer to that can only be found in this debate, in this outpouring of ideas that comes in the 1760s and the 1770s in this dialogue, right? And if you believe the great American historian Bernard Bailyn on this question, the real sort of arena for this debate is in this
intellectual debate.
This intellectual debate is in this new, it's not new, but a very important form of political media in the 18th century, which is pamphlets. These pamphlets that they're writing and everybody's exchanging. They're super cheap to produce. They can pass them around. They can write little notations in them, and then they can read them at public houses, at the taverns and stuff.
It's like a pandemic of ideas almost. The same thing happened, I'm talking about right now with the French Revolution.
Totally.
Like the absolute, unregulation of printing presses was, it's actually horrifying to behold just how horrible of, seditious libel people are able to produce without any, protective measures. If you're wondering, why a lot of Western countries have these very specific rules about seditious libel and what you can print and what is gossip, it all goes back to, honestly, these revolutionary days where people learned about the printing press and how absolutely useful it is in spreading ideas, and they just ran with it rampant, and sometimes they ran way off into the field.
And they were anonymous, right? People didn't sign their name.
A lot of times.
And I mean, and this is not so unfamiliar to us today, right? We have a similar kind of, there's media like this.
Yeah, you think it's almost comparable to social media today? Yeah,
Twitter. Yeah. I mean, I think that the pamphlets are not that different. Remember a few years ago, Arab Spring, right? Yeah. And how important Twitter and Facebook were to spreading those. So, pamphlets and this kind of revolutionary literature that's taking place through, this cheap and rapidly producible form of media that people can share and spread these ideas. Really fast, yeah. And then, and so what's great about this is we actually have a pretty good collection of 18th century pamphlets in the rare book room at the University of Illinois Library. Mm-hmm. So when I teach the Revolution class, we go and we look at some of these. And what's so great is, you have John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. Yeah. And then you have a response from a loyalist. Who's sort of, he doesn't sign his name. I mean, Dickinson didn't sign his name. The loyalist doesn't sign his name. In retrospect, we know who these people are. But all to say, it becomes this whole conversation. And that is where this, again, it's a question of ideology. That is where the revolutionary ideology is shaped. It's you cannot explain the coming of the American Revolution simply by, some lazy explanation that says, oh, it was about taxes. It was a taxation without representation. Yes, but how did people come to kind of conceptualize that, and how did they all kind of rally behind that idea? They rallied behind that idea because people wrote these pamphlets and started talking about it and started making this explanation, this map with which to make sense of their experience.
Yeah, it's really amazing because this small group of people that we generally refer to as founding fathers now, they were the leaders of this whole idea movement, generally, but also that specific time period in the pamphlets and the opening up of the printing presses and figuring out what they could do, they realized how much influence they could have through that media. And I think that it just shows that time period was very unique. It could have happened earlier, and they, and there's some instances these people did try and do it, but it's no real surprise that this, these modern revolutions, as we might call them, occurred when they did towards the end of the 18th century, because really that medium platform wasn't there before. These idealists were there, these revolutionaries, these Enlightenment thinkers, but their ability to get their ideas out to millions of people, I think that didn't exist before, and that's exactly why, coming off of a world war that maybe some people wanted to be in, some people didn't want to be in. Whether or not you're saying the truth isn't exactly the point. Yeah. It's whether or not you can convince people that your point is right.
You're right. And that's, brilliant point. And that's where another, kind of fascinating thing about this kind of pamphlet debate that takes place during the 1760s and 1770s, you can watch them get better at this. Yeah, absolutely. Just like you could probably watch people get better and more effective with their Twitter communications, mastering the rhetoric of 140.
Yeah, how a corporation really figures out how to hone in on social media.
Right. 1776 is when Tom Paine publishes Common Sense, which, you talk about an explosive document. It was immediately runaway bestseller.
Yeah, I think it might have been the most published or most bought pamphlet out there.
That's right.
Yeah, during its time period.
The statistic that I've heard that often gets repeated is that there were, in the colonies there were enough copies of that pamphlet published for there to be, one for every 4 colonists in the colony, in the whole of the British 13 colonies. So, it was very widely published. But if you read it, and everybody should read it, it's a brilliant piece of political rhetoric, and it's also just a really important turning point in the whole debate and the shaping of this ideology, because, many people had made the argument before 1776 and before Common Sense that, okay, so these taxes, they're unconstitutional, right? These taxes, they violate our natural rights because, we're not represented in the British Parliament. There was this whole debate about virtual representation versus actual representation and all that. That was the sort of terrain of the debate before Thomas Paine comes along. Yeah. And, it's all about,
extremely complicated.
Yeah, it's all about, like, on the terms of the British Constitution as people understood it, are we being treated fairly?
Yeah, and speaking of that Constitution, people should know that British Constitution is a very, very vague thing. Sure. It's not exactly a written document. It's a collection of common law documents, things that came to be from just hearsay and tradition, mixed in with actual verifiable documents, either ratified by kings, statutes, etc. But it's not like the U.S. Constitution at all.
Right. So that's why people were sort of discussing this, right?
Because
it was up for grabs.
Yeah, it was up for grabs.
Yeah, lots of debate about, but still, what's so interesting is that, in the 1760s, you take people like Jefferson, you take people like Dickinson, John Adams wrote a couple of influential pamphlets, James Otis, some of these early kind of radicals, but they're really debating on the playing field of the British Constitution. They're saying, look, as we understand it, this kind of abstract assemblage of ideas that we call the British Constitution, as we understand it, we're being mistreated. The Parliament is acting in ways that are unconstitutional. But what Paine does in 1776 is he says, actually, I'm not going to make the argument that we're being treated unconstitutionally. I'm going to make the argument that the Constitution itself is flawed, right? Like the whole monarchy, the whole idea of monarchy is bankrupt, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's a really important turning point, but it's important intellectually because he makes that argument. He moves the whole debate off of this previous playing field of, well, okay, so what does the Constitution actually mean? He moves it onto this new playing field, which is like, should we give a damn anyway? Because the Constitution itself is messed up because it's a monarchical system. So he does that, but then the other thing that he does that's so important is rhetorically. He is a genius, right? He, as the title implies, common sense. It's it's so clear. Have you read it?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's a really, if people want to learn, honestly, just how to write a persuasive paper or anything to be really convincing, whether or not you're going into journalism or you just want to learn how to write better.
Yeah.
Like Thomas Paine, people like that. Look at people in history on how they convinced massive amounts of people to believe what they said. Even look at people like Adolf Hitler. There's a reason like that his documents and his speech pattern were so convincing.
Yeah.
You can look to these people, and Thomas Paine is a wonderful example of how influential propaganda can be and how just successful one can be just with words on a paper. Because you go from thinking about ourselves in the realm of a British Empire to going to convincing people subtly that maybe this whole idea of a British Empire doesn't work with us.
Yeah.
And not only that, but you get people to mass publish it. You really convince people, and it becomes almost a rallying cry. And to be able to do that, that's a real great case study. And everyone, it's an infamous document, or famous depending on where you're from.
Yeah.
That really shows how useful propaganda is, and not just how useful it is, almost
powerful.
Yeah, powerful, and just how pertinent it is to that time period.
Yeah.
It's almost just hard to describe how influential Paine and Dickinson and those guys were, and how you describe how they get better through the Revolution. When you get up to 1776, they got their agenda, and they know what to do, they know what to say, and it's just really amazing, political rhetoric.
Right. Well, and both. Not to sort of kind of diss the 1760s and early 70s either, because what was brilliant about that rhetoric, again, I mean, this is, I think, a reflection of something special going on in the period of the late 18th century. That's some of those pamphlets are pretty technical, right? Yeah. Discussions of what the British Constitution is, and the discussions of natural rights, and kind of rehashings of this political philosophy of the Enlightenment that you're talking about earlier.
It's almost like maybe they sort of realize that a lot of people don't understand those ideas, and perhaps that's not the ideas they really care about.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but I mean, yeah, but just to kind of twist that in a slightly different direction, the fact that these, that this movement takes off, and people are obviously engaging with these texts that are, pretty complicated texts.
Definitely.
You go back and you read some of these pamphlets.
It can be dense.
It's pretty dense. And,
yeah.
I mean, I think that again, kind of gives us a sense of why Thomas Paine was such a game changer, is because his text is not very dense. But if you go back to Jefferson, rights of the British colonists asserted and proved, mm-hmm. It's slow going. It's very technical. It's masterful, of course, and it's brilliant. But I think it also gives us a sense of, where people were at that time. And they were just in this space where political philosophy was really fascinating to a lot of people. Yes. And it was creating a whole movement. And you used the word earlier about, in connection with propaganda, identity. So, one of the most radical things about the American Revolution, and one of the most improbable things about the American Revolution, is it has to do with identity. I mean, mm-hmm. not only were the British colonists under the British Empire, in many ways doing pretty well, right? Particularly the men, particularly the free men in the British Empire, right. And the property owners doing pretty well. They were prosperous. The economy was booming. So they were pretty content under the British system, mm-hmm. kind of economically and politically. But they also identified very strongly, many of them, as Britons, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the things that had to happen in the American Revolution was that these people had to move in their own self-conception, in their own minds, how they thought about themselves. They had to move from I'm a British, subject, to this other thing, which as yet
didn't exist.
Didn't exist, right?
Yeah, they had to change. People had to convince them to change their self-identity.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, going back to the same rhetoric, the same talk, that's why those people are being so persuasive, writing the things that, because it's not just them convincing themselves, it's convincing people to change their identity. And that's whether or not they were, by the end they were clearly trying to do it, but in the beginning they perhaps were just trying to, get the legislation out of there. But where do you think the turning point, not a specific year, but a circa turning point between getting the legislation off the colonists, like what was coming, and the future legislation, ending those precedents, from that to we don't want to be a part of this empire anymore? Like the rhetoric. What do you think that rhetoric change occurred?
So, I would say I would really look at 76 and Tom Paine. Of course, there are moments before that. The Intolerable Acts are a big moment. In 1774, the British government, in response to the Tea Party of 1773, the British government passes these 4 notorious pieces of legislation. Right. Among other things, they shut down the whole of the Boston port. They just closed the Boston port,
which they probably deserved.
Well, in many ways, there was a lot of revolutionary action going on in Boston. But at that time, in response to that, the colonists of Boston sent around these circular letters to the other at this point illegal colonial legislatures and sort of underground governments that
committees of correspondence.
Yeah, exactly. The committees of correspondence, which were sort of these kind of underground, latent governments,
shadow governments. That's what I call them.
Yeah, which were taking shape, and in reply to this, kind of appeal that the Massachusetts the sort of committee of correspondence in Massachusetts sent out, I think virtually every one of the it was a big and kind of almost unanimous outpouring of support. against the British Empire.
Definitely, yeah. When they did that.
And when they did that. So.
Yeah, and to almost answer my own question, I think the change really comes when the Sons of Liberty were seen not as this radical group, but as a patriot group. Like, when they started to be called patriots, I think that's a distinctive, like, even by some people that would call themselves loyalists even after, like, maybe changed loyalists, this and that, but, in the middle, when the people in the middle, that 20% that really didn't know in, like, 1773, 74, like, where their loyalties lied, they were just kind of waiting it out. I think when they started to refer to the Sons of Liberty as patriots, or at least as people with a good cause, I think that's when the rhetoric change really happened. Because before that, people, they didn't get a lot of support. Outside of Massachusetts, they were a radical, almost, like I said before, domestic terrorist group. But after, 1773, and when the British, put their axe down and especially tried to put down the law on Boston in the Massachusetts area, I think that's when the turning point of the rhetoric really started to change. Yeah. And of course, now the colonists, those radical colonists, if we want to call them that, had a bit of a platform. There was an actual reason because they were being specifically targeted, in which you might look back as a British subject and be like, maybe we shouldn't have did that there. Maybe we should have backed off, let some things subside. But it's interesting to see, because even someone like Benjamin Franklin, early on, he was not a radical. Yeah. He didn't believe it. A lot of them, of course, weren't. John Adams, he defended the British soldiers at the Boston Massacre really well, and, basically got them off of the charges. But after 1773, even those people were in the radical camp.
Well, and Adams is a good example, because I think that those intolerable acts, the Boston Port Bill shutting down Boston Harbor, that was a slap in the face. Adams in taking that case to defend the British troops at the Boston Massacre. He was, first of all, it was a kind of big personal. He did that at big personal risk to his reputation and everything. But he kind of made this really, really careful and principled argument about, it's law. It comes down to law, where we have to be governed by laws. We can't be governed by passions. It's well understood that many people perceive this as the colonists felt aggrieved by what had happened at the massacre, but the facts supported the argument that he made, which was that the shout of fire came from behind the troops, or from from this other. All to say, I mean, that gets into the kind of complicated story of the whole massacre. But it was then when the British Empire sort of suspended the civil rights of the colonists in Boston that Adams, on that same principle, was so offended. Right? If we are going to be governed by laws and not by passions, then we can't all.
Then you can't do this either.
Right. Yeah. So. But all to say about this kind of, wherever that turning point is, you got to keep in mind how radical that turning point, was and really is, as historians looking back on it. If it was in response to the intolerable acts and these committees of correspondence sending around the circular letter from Boston, and everybody sort of got pledging solidarity behind Massachusetts in its plight. Remember now that Pennsylvania and New York and South Carolina and Virginia, the people that lived there did not really see themselves as having all that much in common with the people who lived in Massachusetts prior to this.
Yeah, and that's a hard thing looking back on it as people who like history or just like a good story. You think of these people already as Americans, but really, early colonial times will tell them they're not, right? Yeah. They're colonists from specific regions, specific colonies, and they had those ideologies, in their heads. And you definitely see that when the revolution itself starts in warfare. The South is a little bit different when it comes to warfare. It wasn't united at all like the New England area and Nathaniel Greene and those kinds of people. There was a lot of, half of the war in the South was the Patriot cause trying to rout the Loyalist cause. Yeah. And it's interesting to see because it's that almost mistake of foresight that people do when they look at history. Textbooks do it all the time, where we're already thinking of these people as Americans. Exactly. We're already thinking them as, a patriotic cause, and that we're almost, the predestination thing, we're thinking of them already as the victors. Yeah. Right? But if you look at it from the, if you can manage to shut your mind off after, whatever date you're already on, don't think ahead too much, because those people didn't have that ability to do it.
It's the great skill for historians to be able to constantly remind yourself that, wherever you are, the people there don't know what's coming, right? And
Definitely.
they don't know how this story turns out. And, on this same subject of kind of the inertia, or what, to use the fancy historical term here, the teleology of the narrative, that the idea that we know where this is going, it's part of a preordained narrative towards independence, or certainly towards the victory of whether it's the war. And then the other improbable piece of the era of the American Revolution is that once independent, once they've won the war, the idea that they would then join together in a single nation.
Yeah, that wasn't confirmed at all. No.
Not at all, right? Not at all. And that actually, in some ways, is more improbable than the other.
That's extremely radical, yeah. Especially you can read it in the article. There's antipathy between the colonists, like north. It's not even north-south. It's just colony to colony. People with massive ideological differences, and yeah, I definitely agree. The fact that the Articles of the Confederation got created at all is, I would say that's almost more radical than them, deciding to go through with the revolutionary process.
And then, so you take the Articles of Confederation, which of course, that was a weak confederacy,
Definitely.
A weak government. And in some ways that, okay, yes, I agree with you, that's improbable. But that's kind of a little bit more consistent with the rhetoric of the American Revolution, because the idea of a strong centralized government remote from where people live.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
That was what supposedly the American Revolution had been fought against, right? This idea of a distant empire where people don't have direct representation, they don't have, close connections with their representatives and their leaders in government. So the Confederation was a weak confederacy of these independent states,
Definitely,
right? That preserved their sovereignty. Excuse me. So I agree that even that was improbable. What was even more improbable was the Constitution in 1787, which created a much more powerful government, right? Not a weak confederation, but an actual federal system, a federalist system.
Speaking of that system, here, we're almost running out of time here. We've been talking a little while.
Yeah.
But speaking of that Constitutional Convention, a lot of times when we look back on it, we see it through particularly two people's lens, the Hamiltonian lens and the Jeffersonian lens. Mm-hmm. Which do you think, obviously I think the one who really prevailed in the conventions was the Hamiltonian ideas, because the federal government was established and the precedents weren't there, but the ability for the government to get stronger was there, something that Jefferson probably didn't like at all. Yeah. But where do you think, just as a personal opinion, where do you think you fall into, like, with ideology? The Hamiltonian camp or the Jeffersonian camp?
Well, I think, I would say, first of all, maybe to dodge the question, I think that the person who is most responsible for that Constitution, 1787, in many ways is Madison.
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
And
the father of the Constitution.
Yeah. And I think that what is kind of brilliant about, well, not kind of brilliant, what is brilliant about what he came up with and how he also articulated it in the Federalist Papers, the logic of this system is that it sort of brought both of those tendencies together. The Jeffersonian sort of small government, small, kind of weak interest in a kind of weak central government and power kind of reserved to the sort of local level, versus the kind of Hamiltonian idea, which is, the government has to be energetic and strong at the federal level, so that, sort of a certain set of tasks, a certain set of functions that only a federated government can perform can actually take place. And, Madison was so brilliant, not only for creating a government that could do that without either tendency overcoming the other, but then also articulating it in a climate where so many people were suspicious on either side, right? The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And, what he was able to do was, he said, let's not be naive. We cannot, this is in those debates, yet another one of the really radical, outcomes of the American Revolution was this new logic of government that Madison kind of articulated, especially some of the more famous of the Federalist Papers. But, the old logic of government was that people, a republic needed to have virtuous leaders, and then it was the rest of our job to sort of trust them, that they were wise and that they knew what they were doing, and because they were virtuous, they had a liberal education, etc. They were elites.
Okay. Yeah.
That was the kind of logic of monarchy, and even somewhat of the logic of like classical republicanism built on this idea of virtue. Well, one of the kind of radical outcomes of the American Revolution in terms of political philosophy is Madison's move to say, well, actually what we know is that we can't really trust that leaders are going to be virtuous. So what we really need to, we know that leaders are probably going to eventually be self-interested. And it used to be that governments were designed to try to keep self-interest out of it. That in fact, those virtuous leaders, what made them virtuous is they pushed their own interest down. Like they kept it out. They actually saw past their own interest, right, to the collective good.
But that's not exactly realistic.
But Madison said we can't trust. We can't actually make a government based on trust. In fact, what we should do is acknowledge that self-interest, right, is going to happen. And in fact, like, it's probably not bad that it happens. I mean, this is his line in the Federalist Papers: ambition should be made to counter ambition. We shouldn't try to prevent people from asserting their own self-interests in government. What we should do is design a government wherein
it can take it.
People pursuing their own self-interest will just kind of cancel out, right? Mm-hmm. That these factions will never the factions that will form as people sort of pursue their own self-interest, those factions will never become so powerful that they overwhelm the collective good. And, I mean, we don't have time to go into his whole sort of brilliant articulation of why the Constitution achieved that, but basically it comes down to sort of dividing up the powers, right? And making each one of those powers, each branch of government, each sort of, branch of government in the federal system, plus state governments and federal governments, they all have specific powers, and they're all sort of jealously guarding those powers and asserting those powers. And it's in the kind of competition among all those different forces in government that we kind of get to this collective good. We think about today, our government is gridlock and a lot of conflict and a lot of, people trying to shut the government down. And, what would Madison say? I think he'd probably be disappointed in how the government is actually functioning, but it is sort of the design, right? That people jealously pursue their power, right? Ambitions in this kind of, conflict-oriented way. So
and I think, like, to answer that a little bit more, in my opinion, like what you were saying about what would Madison think of the government today, I think he wouldn't be too surprised. I mean, obviously, he'd be shell-shocked by what's going on.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be dismayed, but yeah.
I feel like if Jefferson saw what was going on, he'd just go into a corner in depression. But there's a famous quote, it was by some McCarthy, but you don't want to see bureaucracy, basically, that is efficient. Because if you have that, that's where ambition can be unregulated. That's where ambition can be, that's where, these guys were historians themselves. They were probably looking back at the Roman Republic and see exactly how that republic turned into an empire that was separated by civil wars and all this stuff, where ambitious men were technically not allowed to be ambitious, but when they were able to contract the power of hundreds of men, not just one man.
Right.
Or one man.
Unchecked.
Unchecked, right? Unchecked. Because there wasn't this complicated bureaucracy where everyone had to say, yes, no, yes, no.
Yeah.
But when you see things today, that's why it is so slow. It is part of the system. Now, perhaps, obviously some parts of the system are not well oiled enough, but there is a design to the slow bureaucracy. And I think, like you were saying, that was intentionally designed because he knew, and the people in the convention generally knew, that ambition, you're not going to eliminate that. It's part of human nature. Just like sometimes virtue is a part of human nature, the bad parts are too. And all you can do is sort of, use them and prevent them from getting too strong. So I think that's what I'd say he wouldn't be too surprised about the slowness of it. I'd say he'd just be surprised at where this country's went.
Yeah. Maybe on that note we can
end it there.
Yeah. So it's been fun talking.
All right. Thanks for being on.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to say thank you to Professor Morrissey for his lively participation. I also advise you to seek out Professor Morrissey's new publication, a book entitled Empire by Collaboration, Indians, Colonists, and Governments in Colonial Illinois Country. And next time on the Everything History podcast, we will continue the story of the French Revolution and learn what drove King Louis XVI and his family to attempt flight from France.
Thank you very much.